Hello everyone, as promised, this is my review of the new Oregon Trail, American Settler by the Learning Company. This is actually not a new version of the Oregon Trail. This is a sequel which starts off where you left off in 1849. And the point of it is to build your settlement. Now, I wanted to do some background history first. This is the map of the Oregon Trail from the 1984 version of the game, with inaccurate state borders. This is a 1907 map which makes the same mistake, putting the 1907 borders into place over the historic Oregon Trail. And this is a more accurate map from Wikimedia, where you can see the Oregon Territory in the extreme northwest there, the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican Cession, and then of course the eastern states and territories. Now in 1853, Oregon Territory was split in half, putting the Washington Territory in the north there. Then the eastern portion of Oregon became part of that territory in 1859. And then in 1863, the Washington Territory got its present-day borders. It's now Washington State. And then also in 1863, the Idaho Territory was built from what is now Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, which included parts of the Louisiana Purchase. So there are the modern-day borders, although Montana was admitted in 1889. Wyoming and Idaho were admitted in 1890, if I'm not mistaken, as was Washington State. Oregon was admitted in 1859. The Oregon Trail unofficially closed around 1869 or so with the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad by the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroad companies. There's the famous Golden Spike ceremony in Promontory, Utah. Now, there are a number of historical inaccuracies in the new game beyond maps that I thought I had to cover. The most glaring is their treatment of medical treatment in the early 19th century. It is true that there was a great deal of ignorance in terms of medicine at the time. I have the photo there of Louis Pasteur, who was one of the first modern microbiologists who began to turn the tide. However, the practices portrayed in the game of expelling sick people from the community along the lines of, who knows, maybe ancient tribes or more recently Nazis who murdered the sick. This is, as far as I know, historically inaccurate. A great deal of effort was made to help the sick. But the differences were, of course, that they were less effective in those days at treating the sick. And they emphasized care in the home rather than hospital treatment. The hospitals, of course, were hotbeds of disease. They weren't ideal places to recover. Pasteur attempted to remedy this, as did Sir Joseph Lister, seen here. But well into the late 19th century, hospitals were not the core of medical treatment. In the game, you have to build an infirmary before you can even treat the sick. You expel them otherwise, which is just ridiculous. This is a period lithograph of a house call. Doctors would generally visit your house if you became very ill at the time. You can see this in old westerns, actually. There's Florence Nightingale, who was actually only a nurse, but was very important to establishing modern hospitals. She began in the Crimean War, where British Army hospitals were insufficient, and enlisted the help of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the railway and shipping promoter, you could say, who was also a genius engineer. In the process, they promoted the first prefab construction, because the hospital was designed and built in pieces in England and then shipped out to the Crimea to be reconstructed. There are the drawings. Oh, another way that Brunel is amazing. Now this is Jean-Henri Dumont, who founded the modern-day Red Cross, and in the process introduced the idea of the Red Cross as a medical symbol. This is a memorial from 1863 when it was first used in a war in Denmark. This is another inaccuracy of the game, in that it's used on the infirmary when the game is set in the 1840s, almost 20 years before this happened. Incidentally, there's Clara Barton, who founded the American Red Cross, and then we have Henry Davison, who founded the International Red Cross, essentially, through several different organizations. This, of course, included the Red Crescent for Muslim countries, because the cross is a reference to Christianity, the crescent is a reference to Islam. And of course in Israel you can also see red stars of David, but that's of course only in Israel. And in essence, I wanted to emphasize all this because all of this history is important. However, in the game, it is not portrayed accurately, and it actually dumbs down the experience, I think. Another thing that I have to bring up, just as a matter of responsibility, is that I think the game gives a very poor portrayal of gun safety. It's not something you would talk about very much with an adult game, but this game is marketed towards children. I feel maybe they could have handled this more responsibly. I'm not a gun owner, I'm not a gun safety expert, but there are a number of really obvious safety problems in how firearms are portrayed in the game. There's some examples of firearms rules, from websites. I'm not an expert, so I've used outside references. And basically the idea is you never point a gun at anything you're not willing to destroy, you always assume it's loaded, and so on. And basically in the game, if you hunt, you just shoot around people. And I mean, obviously that's totally irresponsible, in real life, and you have to treat a kid's game in this way. Safety has to be promoted very strongly. You shouldn't have anything that would suggest otherwise. And the thing about it is, shooting around people in this way, in an ordinary situation, it's insanely dangerous, and it's being portrayed as if it's normal in the game. You'll see this later when I do the review. So, rather than dwelling on the negative, I'll get into the game now. So, anyway, it appears that Gameloft were involved in promoting this, even though it's a learning company game. Gameloft do a lot of mobile games, and this is basically a mobile game because it runs on either Android or iOS. And there's the opening theme, if that's the word. It's freeware, actually. The business model is that in-game purchases make the money for the company. So there are these consent screens for parents because they don't want their children eating up all their money on this game. So then you choose to be the father or the mother. They have a lot of redneck humor in this game. A lot of misspellings deliberately. I don't know if that's good or bad. And so there's the consent again, and there's the opening scene. And you at first roll into this town. It's not clear whether this is your town or a neighboring town. And you do some work for your first money to get what you need to start your own neighborhood. It's generally the kinds of odd jobs that you would actually have in the Old West, or even well into the 20th century, actually. Farm work and things like that. Running errands for people. This section of the game, or segment of the game, is not very long. You only have to do a few things before you're on your way. One thing you do get to see is that your energy gets depleted as you perform tasks, and later on in the game you have to wait for your energy to recover. It's a way of pressuring people into spending money because you can spend actual money for in-game upgrades that will increase your energy, and it can become a waiting game in the later stages of the game. I'm obviously going to skip all that so that you don't have to watch it. Here you are starting your own town, and you have your family, and you have Cap Masterson, who is your advisor. And of course you do a fair amount of tree chopping because you need the lumber. Levels are determined partly by how well you're doing rather than anything else. Really more so than anything else. Where you are doesn't really have anything to do with it. And here's an attempt at their medical model. Can actually help her with your medicine on board the wagon there. But you have to build the infirmary later for the reasons I described earlier. And your spouse keeps pressuring you with one or another thing. I don't know if that's sexist or not.